So the theme of the lecture is it's a case study in medievalism, particularly this specific Norse legend of the Volsung story, the Volsung family, and particularly Sigurd the Volsung, and how that was reinterpreted by both William Morris and also JRR Tolkien in the 20th century. So one of the things that I always try to keep in mind with both of these creative figures, and that I think it's good to keep in sort of in the background throughout tonight's talk, is that medievalism is not just one thing. It's not, I mean, I'm going to be focusing on literature and on writing, but obviously medievalism is much more than that. You know, in the case of William Morris, medievalism is maybe one of the things that ties together almost everything he did in many different fields. He was constantly drawing inspiration from medieval art, medieval architecture, medieval social practices like guilds and things like that, as well as medieval literature and medieval culture in many ways. So there's many different ways to take inspiration, and literature is just one of them. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But in the background, there's all these other ways. And one that I think is particularly relevant to both of these authors is that both of these authors, but especially Morris, were concerned with producing their own books. So writing wasn't, you know, now we just think of like writing as like disembodied text that's stored digitally. That's not how William Morris or Tolkien would have thought of things. Morris in particular, as was mentioned, was a publisher and a designer of his own books, designed his own fonts, produced his own paper, went through all the processes of book binding, and was in control of every last aspect of the appearance of books. And even actually, we'll see some of these images later, he even had artist friends of his produce woodcuts so that he could use woodcuts in a similar way to how medieval books had woodcuts as illustrations. Yeah, so to dive right in, the medieval text that this story mostly comes from, at least for our purposes tonight, is Völsunga Saga, the Saga of the Volsungs, which Morris and his Icelandic collaborator Eiríkur Magnússon translated in 1870 as the story of the Volsungs and the Niblungs with certain songs from the Elder Edda. And he included this, or they included this appendix of material at the conclusion of the translation, these songs from the Elder Edda, that is the Poetic Edda, Old Norse poems which also dealt with the same story and which the saga author appears to have used as sources for the saga. So the saga is actually a retelling of older stories that are preserved in poetic form. So it's just kind of interesting that in the very first, this was the very first English translation of this major legendary saga. And I just find it kind of interesting that in the very earliest translation, there was already this kind of scholarly aspect of comparing the saga to the sources that the saga author used. Now, the most famous aspect of this story is, of course, Sigurd the Volsung, the Dragon Slayer. As you can see in this central image here, he is most famous as the man without fear, the only one who was able to kill this monstrous dragon Fafnir, which he does in the story by ambushing him from below as he goes to drink water at a river. And so this is considered to be the greatest feat of bravery and courage and so forth that establishes Sigurd's name as a true legend. But there's also a lot more to the story too. And I won't be able to get into all of it because I'll be focusing on Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, and particularly the dragon, which is Fafnir, and then the smith, Regin, who's a dwarf, who is actually Fafnir's brother. And actually, even more specifically, I'll be kind of focusing on Regin and Fafnir's family lineage. Who are these creatures? What defines these supernatural beings that seem to shape the background of the story that the human characters are living in? Whether it's the dangers of monsters or the benefits of divine guidance, for example, because this is also a story in which Odin and Frigg and other Norse deities intervene. So the overall suggestion I'm going to try to make is that for both William Morris and for Tolkien, in their various retellings of this story and their reinterpretations of it, they looked at this this family of characters, the dwarf who's a smith, and the monster who's a dragon, and then there's another one who's a shapeshifter called Otter, and then there's a father who is kind of mysterious. They looked at this and they used this to develop and express what I call a romantic philosophy of craftsmanship. Basically, it really kind of has to do with the production of things of value. The smith produces things of value. That's why the smith has a positive role for both Morris and Tolkien as a craftsman, because that's the kind of figure that they both personally admired. And in Morris's case, you can argue he was a craftsman. So he's very sympathetic to this view. The dragon, on the other hand, is known for hoarding gold. He hoards treasure. He doesn't produce anything of value. He simply confiscates everything of value from everyone else and then jealously guards it. So yeah, that's basically the roadmap for where we're going and what I'll hope to suggest over the course of this lecture. So I have my dedication here to my great aunt and great uncle, who were world travelers who indeed visited Iceland with the William Morris Society, and also gave my young self a copy of Tolkien's The Hobbit. So in many ways, they are inspirations for some of the work that I've done and for my own attempts at learning and travel and all sorts of things. And then on the right-hand side here, so I've listed, basically, if you're interested in more information, you're like, oh, he mentioned something or he talked about something, what was that? This just provides some of the work that I'm drawing on. Some of it actually has links, so I'll make the slides available. So if anyone wants to look at some of the stuff I'm drawing on, it's there. The only really important thing I'd like to say is that a colleague of mine, Christopher Crocker, and myself have a book coming up next year in 2022 in Boydell and Brewer's Medievalism series, and it's going to be called Transforming Old Norse Icelandic Literature. And in that book, my article actually does discuss Morris and Tolkien. So basically, that's the most important one. Though there pretty much will be like a longer version of this type of discussion, like as a chapter in that book. Yeah. So what is Völsunga Saga, the Saga of the Volsung? So I will only be able to get into a small amount of it because there's so many, there's so much that you could get into. But basically, this is a story that appears to be distorted history from around the time of the fall of Rome, or the late Roman Empire, and after the fall of Rome. So this map is from a more recent translation of the Saga of the Volsungs by Jesse Pyack. And here he just shows how these different tribal groups were basically fighting over the spoils of the Roman Empire. And the Roman frontiers were being pushed back, and there were battles between Romans and the barbarians, and there was battles between different barbarians to see who would be able to carve out like successor kingdoms and stuff. And that's really that's where we get the historical figures who inhabit this saga. But they aren't all equally historical. Indeed, like there's a great deal of question as to how much of this is historical at all. But that said, there are some figures in the saga who seem to be at the very least named after particular historical figures, such as Gunnar, king of the Burgundians, who died in 437, and most famously, perhaps Attila the Hun, who died in 453. So those are historical figures. It doesn't mean that what the saga says about them, or like, particularly that some of the most like vengeful and disturbing acts of betrayal that occur in the saga like actually happen the way the saga says. But nevertheless, there's a historical basis for these figures. However, in the case of Sigurd could almost be considered maybe like sort of a King Arthur type figure, in the sense that he seems to be more legendary, or at least like it's possible that Sigurd was based on a historical figure of this era, or earlier or later, but it's not as clear that is the case as with these other figures. And that's maybe not surprising, because Sigurd is also the character who is most involved with the world of the gods and the world of the supernatural, and he's the dragon slayer. So it's his part of the story that has the most supernatural, mythological elements to it. So in this saga, there have been historical elements mixed together with legendary and mythological elements. So yeah, you do have people that appear to be based on historical figures, but conflicts between tribal groups that existed at this time, but there's also a heavy amount of intervention from gods and goddesses and supernatural beings of various sorts. So I've got an Icelandic commentator here, Grímur Thomson, who explains the blood feud structure of the Saga of the Volsung. So at the center of the Saga of the Volsungs is Sigurd achieves the height of human heroism by slaying the dragon Fafnir. But all around him is a storm of rivalries between humans. And indeed, like, humans are just as deadly as any other monster or supernatural being in this saga. So in the middle of this humans versus nature or humans versus monster story, there's all of this betrayal and revenge that goes beyond the limits of life, revenge that often is in some sense even suicidal, or requires killing those that you love to avenge those that you loved more. There are cases in this saga of people killing their own children to get back at their enemies whose children they also are. So like this is a story in which families and dynasties are destroyed by greed, basically. And specifically, it's greed for this one particular treasure. This treasure is at the center of the story, and it's also at the center of the story of these shapeshifters who I'm going to be focusing on. So what I've got here is a genealogy of the saga characters, and I've added a few things. Like one of them on the right, you can see over here. This is the horses. So Sleipnir is Odin's horse. He's the greatest horse in the world. And in the saga, Odin advises Sigurd and gets him the best of horses, which is Grani. So Grani is actually descended from Sleipnir in the same kind of way that Sigurd and the Volsungs are actually descended from Odin. So there's these, the earthly equivalents of mythical beings. And that's kind of captures a bunch of the story, that the conflict begins in the world of the gods and giants, and it passes through into the human world. So I've circled in red all the different owners of this treasure called the Otter's Ransom. I'll explain where the Otter's Ransom comes from shortly. But the point is that everyone is constantly fighting each other, betraying each other, killing each other, and trying to trick each other and so forth, so that they can get their hands on this treasure. This is the greatest treasure in the world, a ransom that was gathered by the gods. But of course, spoiler alert, at the very end, everyone betrays everyone else, and everyone is dead, and the last people who know where the treasure is refuse to give up its location, so nobody gets the treasure. So all this vengeance and killing and feuding and betrayal, it all ends up, people end up empty-handed. Now they have glory, but do they have survival? So there's this, I don't know, I shouldn't say that this is a story that is skeptical of the value of wealth, but it sees the negative potential of wealth, absolutely. And that's, I think, another theme that both Morris and Tolkien really, really picked up on, the negative potential of wealth. So this is a chart from an article called William Morris and the Poetic Edda. This just, what it shows is the calligraphic manuscripts that Morris produced in the 1860s and 1870s. So Morris would actually write out by hand like his entire translation projects, and he was actually quite accomplished in doing so as a script writer, I guess you'd say. So that's kind of like the precursor to his work as a publisher, was his work in producing manuscripts. So I've highlighted the translation, the story of the Volsungs and Niblungs here, as well as its prologue. So this is when he produced this, 1869 to 1870, and these items were published in 1870 as the first translation of this particular saga. And so in a way, everything else that I'm discussing in this lecture all follows from this original 1870 publication, the first appearance of this Icelandic story, or this more generally Norse story, in English. So what we'll see is that by Morris himself and also by Tolkien, this story took on a much larger life than simply one translation. It inspired many more creative responses of various types, responses which perhaps inevitably kind of varied from the story somewhat, but also like took the same themes and developed them further and further and further. So in the prologue to their translation, Story of the Volsungs and the Niblungs, Morris and Magnússon write this famous statement. And this, I think, is a very interesting and very telling statement, very telling of the romanticism of the 19th century. We must say again how strange it seems to us that this Volsung tale should never before have been translated into English. For this is the great story of the North, which should be to all our race what the tale of Troy was to the Greeks. To all our race first and afterwards, when the change of the world has made our race nothing more than a name of what has been, a story too. That should it be to those that come after us, no less than the tale of Troy has been to us. So there's a lot here, but one thing that I think is worth pointing out, so by the tale of Troy, they're referring to the Homeric Epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also not just the epics of Homer, but the whole cycle of stories about the fall of Troy and the Trojan War, and the position that those stories occupied in Greek culture. The epics of Homer had this function of like, it's sometimes referred to as pan-Hellenism, meaning that all the different Hellenic speaking groups, they all knew about the legend of the fall of Troy, they all knew about the Trojan War, and so this was a story that they all had in common. And so the idea of the great story of the North is that Sigurd is going to be kind of like a northern Achilles. He's going to be this, like in the same way that Achilles could be perhaps like a pan-Hellenic hero, Sigurd could be like a pan-Germanic hero. And indeed, we'll get into that shortly, where Morris and Magnússon all explain like clearly how they see this to be the case. So this is, it's basically they're framing this as the Northern European equivalent of Homer. Now, can the story live up to this? I'm not entirely sure. My old professor, Richard Harris, used to say that the Saga of the Volsungs is the greatest story of all time, but not told very well. And that's just because the poems that it's based on conflict with each other in some ways. And so therefore, there are some parts of the story that don't seem to fit together fully. I mean, that's part of why they wanted to include some of the source poems with it, so people can see where the saga author was getting the story from. And I should also just mention that this is a woodcut by Morris's friend, the artist Walter Crane. This was created for his epic poem, Sigurd the Volsung. And it shows a tree called Barnstock in the Hall of the Volsungs. This seems to have religious significance. Some might compare this to the world tree in Norse mythology. But there's this tree in the center of the hall is also the way that Odin intervenes in the Volsungs' history, because he places a sword in this tree that's meant for the Volsung dynasty. And so he bestows his favor on them in this way. So Morris had this interesting habit of introducing his translations in general with poetry. So he would write like a short poem of some kind to express his feelings about a particular work. So I'll just read his. This is from his introduction to the Story of the Volsung. So I'll just read his poetic introduction here. So draw ye round and hearken, English folk, unto the best tale pity ever wrought, of how from dark to dark bright Sigurd broke, of Brynhild's glorious soul with love distraught, of Gudrun's weary wandering unto naught, of utter love defeated utterly, of grief too strong to give love time to die. So Morris sees extremes of human emotion, extremes of the human mind in this story, particularly extremes of love and hate, and likewise, as Greenwood Thompson had said, and also extremes of fame and extremes of glory. So this second part is a quotation of their exact translation of the saga. This is about the fame of Sigurd. So he was sprinkled with water and had to name Sigurd, of whom all men speak with one speech, and say that none was ever his like for growth and goodliness. He was brought up in the house of King Hjalprek, in great love and honor. And so it is that whenso all the noblest men and greatest kings are named in the olden tales, Sigurd is ever put before them all for might and prowess, for high mind and stout heart, wherewith he was far more abundantly gifted than any other man in northern parts of the wide world. So just a brief comment on the style of the translation. So the way that Morris and Magnússon produced the translations was that they would be reading the sagas and they would focus on producing like as basically as readable as possible of a contemporary English translation, which probably much more resembled contemporary 19th century English writing. But then after the fact, Morris wanted to look up particular Icelandic words, especially Icelandic words that used to exist in English but no longer exist in English. So he was also trying to resurrect old expressions, things like this. So I just think you can see a lot of the, I guess, ideological influence on Morris's translations. More or less, it's almost like he's trying to resurrect like a more Icelandic version of English, if I could put it that way. So yeah, I just think it's interesting the way the expressions that they choose to use, like all men speak with one speech, for example. I think you can detect like a romantic view of the Old Norse culture in this particular style of translation. Okay, so on to these creatures that Sigurd encounters. So Regin is the main one that Sigurd interacts with. Regin is a dwarf, and he is Sigurd's tutor. He's Sigurd's foster father, which is a very important relationship in the Old Norse culture. So he's responsible for being a mentor to Sigurd in a lot of ways, and which makes it all the worse that he eventually betrays him. He also is the one who forges Sigurd's sword, with which he accomplishes the death of Fafnir. So he's responsible, he contributes very directly to the killing of Fafnir, making Sigurd's glory possible. And actually, he's also the one that suggests going after Fafnir too. So there's this untrustworthy aspect of his character where the reason that he wants Sigurd to kill Fafnir is so that he can have Fafnir's treasure, because he thinks that treasure is his. So earlier I showed the sequence of who possesses this treasure, and basically the treasure is a ransom for the lives of the gods, and it's first possessed by Regin's father, and then Fafnir kills Regin's father and takes it. So basically it's a dispute inside this family as to who gets this treasure, and Regin thinks it's his. He needs Fafnir out of the way, so he recruits Sigurd to be his agent in this. But of course, he plans to kill him right afterwards so that he can keep the treasure for himself. So I'll just read this passage again to give a sense of the style of the translation. This is Regin's narrative in the Story of the Volsungs. Thus the tale begins, said Regin. Hreidmar was my father's name, a mighty man and wealthy, and his first son was named Fafnir, his second Otter, and I was the third, and the least of them all for prowess and good conditions. But I was cunning to work in iron and silver and gold, whereof I could make matters that availed somewhat. Other skill my brother Otter followed, and had another nature withal, for he was a great fisher, and above other men herein, and that he had the likeness of an otter by day, and dwelt ever in the river, and bare fish to the bank in his mouth, and his prey would he ever bring to our father, and that availed him much. For the most part he kept him in his otter gear, and then he would come home and eat alone, slumbering, for on the dry land that he might see naught. But Fafnir was by far the greatest and grimmest, and would have all things about called his. So here we have the only genealogy that the saga provides for this tribe, or this family of strange figures. So the father of the family is Hreidmar or Reidmar, and we are not told what exactly he is. I would suspect that he might even be a giant, but it's hard to say. Or the whole group might be classified as dwarves in the same way that Regin is a dwarf. but they also seem to have this shape-shifting ability. So Fafnir seems to begin as a human-like creature, as a person, as a man. But after he kills his father, Raedmar, to get the treasure, that's when he transforms into a dragon. And it's said that in doing this, he's assisted by a quote-unquote Helm of Terror. So the Helm of Terror may be an object that enables him to turn into a dragon. So whoever puts on this helmet becomes a dragon, possibly. In the same way that Otter transforms into an otter by putting on a magic otter skin. So whoever puts that on can turn into an otter, perhaps. So perhaps their shape-shifting is simply the result of magical artifacts that they have. But it's also possible that they are kind of like innately shapeshifters in the way that giants are. Like Loki, for example, he's a giant, and he seems to be able to shapeshift just at will. I mean, and even Odin, who's a god, he also seems to be able to shapeshift at will. So whatever these beings are, they are shapeshifters. Yeah, and they have a different. Each of them has a different character. Regin is the craftsman. He's the creator figure. Fafnir is the dragon. He's the monster. He's the one who's defined by covetousness and violence. And then finally, there's Otter. Otter, who is more like innocent. Which is interesting because usually among the giants or among the dwarves, among shapeshifters, among whatever types of creatures these are, there's not a lot of ones who are innocent. They're generally quite formidable and nasty, as Raedmar, Regin, and Fafnir all are in their own ways. So at the very start of the Otter's Ransom, this dwarf Andvari, he's the one who actually gathers and creates the treasure. So like Regin, he's a dwarf. Loki, I'll read this section here. Loki causes problems for the gods, as he often does, because they're looking for their supper and they need food. So they're like, oh, we'll just eat that otter over there, not realizing that this otter is not an ordinary animal, but is actually a human-like being in an otter's form, and a very powerful one as well. This is, I think, the most important thing, or at least one of the most important things about this family, is that they're able to hold the gods for ransom. Very, very few beings in the Old Norse mythology and related literature are powerful enough that they could threaten the gods' lives and hold them ransom. That's not a very common scenario. That's one of the reasons why I think they might be giants, because some giants are that powerful. So anyway, Loki is the one who kills Otter, and as usual, he causes the problem. So then they make him fix the problem. So he has to go find enough treasure to cover Otter's skin completely in red gold and fill Otter's skin with gold. So he has to gather the greatest treasure in the world in order to release himself and the gods from the ransom that they're being held in. And he gets it by extorting this dwarf Andvari. Andvari has this treasure. Loki says, give it up or I'll kill you, basically, and this succeeds. So this is how he gets the treasure, but as a result, he takes every last piece of wealth from this dwarf, and he even takes the last ring. And as a result, Andvari curses the treasure and says, I hope that no one gets any benefit from this. And that's exactly what happens throughout the entire rest of the story. Everyone who gets the treasure is killed as a result of possessing it, pretty much. So moving into the next main text that I want to look at, this is from Morris's poem, Sigurd the Volsung. So we saw that Morris and Magnússon made this translation of the Saga the Volsungs directly, and they included some translations of poems as well. But then 5 or 6 years after that, William Morris returned to the same story, and he wrote his own version of it, which is an epic poem in 4 books. And this was his own personal favorite of all the poems that he ever published. And I think a lot of people would, no one is going to say that like Morris was the single greatest English language poet of the 19th century, but nevertheless, he was a good poet. He was an established poet. Yeah, I think he was actually offered the poet laureateship at one point. Among Morris's poems, I'm pretty sure Sigurd the Volsung is generally the most critically acclaimed of them. So yeah, this is basically, I would argue that Sigurd the Volsung, this poem kind of occupies like a central place in Morris's literary output, because it's a creative retelling of the Volsung story. So he's able to expand on the themes that he, that he found interesting in the original story. So this is longer than the original story, significantly longer, and he really fleshes out a lot more details. There's a lot more room for interpretation here, and he interprets things in a way that I think reflects the kinds of ideas we were hearing about earlier. His ideas of craftsmanship, his ideas of agency, and avoiding being dehumanized and controlled by an evil power of some type, which is associated with industrialism in Morris's view, and also in Tolkien's view as well. So I just wanted to point out, I won't read all the quotations, but they're there anyway, and I'll make the slides available. But I just wanted to point out that Morris takes Regin, the smith, and makes a more sympathetic figure of him than he is in the original saga. He's almost a hero for a little while, or he's a culture hero. So Morris's, people often comment, or scholars have often commented how Morris's version of Sigurd is actually not just a Germanic warrior. He's also like a fighter for a just society, according to Morris's own sort of utopian idealism. So Morris's ideals and counter ideals kind of find their way into the story as he's telling Sigurd the Volsung, and so in this way, Regin becomes almost like an authorial figure. He becomes almost like a stand-in for Morris himself, someone who's trying to create something, but maybe has his doubts about how effective it will be. So at the end here, you see him. He praises the gift that he has. His gift is his craftsmanship, but he also worries that all it does, the craft that createth a semblance, fails of the heart's desire. So in other words, no matter how good you are at producing things, no matter how much of a master you are at the particular form of things you're trying to produce, you may be, it'll never match up to your heart's desire. You will never be able to create something that's the exact same as how you imagined it in your mind. And Morris takes this further in Sigurd the Volsung, because it almost seems like he's wondering where, how did the world become such a violent and corrupt place? Because this is a very violent story with a lot of nasty things that happen. And part of the answer is that the gods are imperfect craftsmen. They try to create the world the way they want it, but they're not able to fully follow through on it. And we'll see this theme like reflected in Tolkien as well. So the one point that I want to make about this slide is that I think this is the key thing for Morris's version of Regin the Smith. It's that Regin the Smith in Sigurd the Volsung actually warns Sigurd that he's going to betray him. He actually warns him. So that's about as exculpatory, I would say, morally as it could get, other than actually just changing the story so that he doesn't betray him at all. It's basically this version of Regin is a much more sophisticated and sympathetic character, and he kind of foresees that he has negative tendencies that he's inherited from his ancestors that he doesn't like. So he actually warns Sigurd about this. And trust not thy life in my hands in the day when most I seem like the dwarfs that are long departed, and most of my kindred I dream. So throughout Sigurd the Volsung, you actually get this story almost of like Regin's fall from grace as he slowly sort of becomes more covetous and greedy himself. And it's actually reflected in his dreams too. So yeah, it's like he's lapsing into a character more like the character of his brother Fafnir or his father Hreidmar, both of which were very greedy, powerful, overbearing, and threatening figures. So in this passage, this also just kind of reflects the ethos of Sigurd the Volsung, where really the triumph that the triumph that the heroes are seeking, the triumph that these families are seeking, is really a triumphant story. It's to craft the story to be sufficiently legendary that it inspires people. That's so it's almost a poem about poetry, or a poem about the role of poetry in society. The way that Sigurd as a legendary figure inspires people, not just of his generation, but of many generations later on. Um, and so it's almost like if the tale comes out perfectly, then all is well that ends well. This is all kind of justified because it's all a story written by the gods. Now, of course, the stories that are composed by Odin, where people have to play the roles that Odin sets out for them, are actually very bloody, and very unpleasant in many ways. So it is kind of interesting to see Morris kind of shoehorn an idealized version of Old Norse society into the story. And it really promised that it's all going to make sense in the end. In this passage, it's almost like Signy is meditating on the problem of evil. You know, why is there evil in the world? And she tells her brother, "We'll know the answer to that question when we reach the halls of the gods." So it's offering like a higher sort of metaphysical, almost utopianism, that may not be completely in keeping with the views of the original culture, but nevertheless strongly reflects Morris's own philosophy of craftsmanship, and utopian sort of idealism in a very interesting way. So I just kind of summarize this. I'll just read this line quickly. "By the side of the sons of Odin shalt thou fashion a tale to be told in the hall of the happy Balder." So again, it's like, then you'll realize all the betrayal was necessary because everything just turned out perfectly in some way. It turned out perfectly to produce the legend that was necessary to be produced, that, you know, had this pan-Germanic sort of function and inspired future societies. And yet, at the same time, and I think this too is kind of reflective of Morris and his trips to Iceland and his search for an ideal to follow. At the same time, there's also the possibility that you can't really trust that in the halls of the gods, everything will actually make sense, that the gods don't really care, or they're just using you, or, you know, I've got a quotation here: "The gods exhibit a strange passivity, and the value of their friendship is to be doubted." Another quotation here at the bottom: Morris emphasizes his idea that the gods do not exist. They are simply reflections or embodiments of man's best moral qualities, of the values and ethics to which mankind should aspire. So here we have almost like an archetypal interpretation of mythology, basically saying that this isn't really about history or even a story to be taken literally. It's more like an expression of ideal qualities that may not even be real. So yeah, there's this question: is this just are the gods and their plan for things just a misleading illusion? What does it mean for Sigurd to triumph and then be betrayed like this? Okay, so I can see I'll need to speed up here to make sure I get through everything. So this slide is just meant to show really the role of Icelandic literature in Morris's output as a source of inspiration. So this table's from Zeroni. On the left, this is all the publications of Morris's that are direct translations of Icelandic works, or at least like direct retellings, like the poem Sigurd the Volsung. But then on the right-hand side, I also included literary projects of Morris's that were more loosely inspired by Old Norse literature. So it's not just direct translations and direct retellings. There are also a lot of Norse elements in creative works and original fictions and original poems of Morris's as well. Now, one thing that ties Morris and Tolkien together is they were both interested in the history of Norse exploration in the West Atlantic, and kind of particularly the mythical sort of development of that. You know, like how are you going to perceive a new world? You know, of course, it's difficult to look at this in a purely historical way because so much legend has been heaped up around it, and there's still a lot of uncertainty as to where the Norse exactly got to. But part of the symbolism that seems to inspire both Morris and Tolkien is the search for an earthly paradise, the search for a new world. Even the world of the gods, or maybe even a world that's actually really old, that's just been forgotten about, to rediscover lost connections, to rediscover lost knowledge. But the point is that there's this almost Messiah sort of attitude toward exploring further west in both Morris and Tolkien's views. Now, it is sometimes treated with skepticism, like in Morris's romance, The Story of the Glittering Plain, for example. They're searching for what's called the land of living men, or the Glittering Plain. It's supposed to be a utopia with no death. So people don't age and they don't die there. They simply stay youthful forever. They're immortal. So it's like the land of the gods almost. But in The Story of the Glittering Plain, it turns out that removing all the challenges from life also removes the meaning from life. And so the Glittering Plain is actually a place worth rejecting. It's actually a dystopia. It's a place where people don't have anything to believe in or fight for or even do. So their faculties just kind of rot, and they're all just sitting around wishing that they could be in the real world and reading books about the conflicts that they themselves are not actually engaged in. And likewise, in the earthly paradise, it seems to be, at least for Morris, that it's really the search, it's the quest or the search that's important, not necessarily the destination. Maybe you will never get to utopia, you'll never actually arrive there, but in striving for it and seeking it, it's that process itself that has value. And here I've got a quotation from one of Morris's quote-unquote Germanic romances. So these are prose romances modeled after medieval prose romances. And a lot of them actually have some pretty strong Norse inspirations to them. And what they are Morris looking at various points in the history of Germanic and Norse societies. So these are prose sequels to Sigurd the Volsung, because they're following that society into the future, all the way to the Viking Age, and later in some cases. And so again, you find these elements of, I guess you might say, romantic naturalism, the idea that this was a culture close to nature, a culture that valued craftsmanship, that valued political freedom. You can see a lot of Morris's sort of utopian ideals for earlier societies being played out in these romances. And these romances are also considered to be something else that ties Morris and Tolkien together, because Morris is even sometimes referred to as the grandfather of fantasy literature, because with these romances, he kind of invented the thing that Tolkien would later make popular, which is the basically inventing new romances. It's almost like they read all the medieval literature they can get their hands on, and there still wasn't enough medieval romances for them, so then they just started writing new ones. So yeah, this is just my sources for William Morris. The slides will be available. Some of those have links. So yeah, I'll get on to Tolkien now. One of the things that ties these two together is also the idea of craftsmanship. So on the left hand there, that's a poster for the first ever display of works by William Morris in Iceland. And then on the right, that is a tapestry project where they took a bunch of Tolkien's paintings and then wove tapestries out of them. So yeah, some very interesting stuff. So Tolkien also expressed this idea of subcreation. Like in Morris, we had the Smith figure worrying that his creations won't live up to what he has in his mind, and that his creations could be corrupted or flawed. He could be corrupted or flawed. And I think you see some echoes of this in Tolkien with his idea of subcreation. So the subcreation in Tolkien's idea was just that an artist creates a model of the world that temporarily persuades readers or viewers or whatever that it's real. And yet that itself is also a dangerous process. So here we see Tolkien's myth of the creation of dwarves, where they're actually kind of created like mechanical beings. They don't actually have souls, and so therefore the god who creates them realizes that he's done something wrong. He's gone against nature. His version of creation was almost like blasphemous. So then he's actually planning to destroy his own creations, as we can see here in this painting. But then the high god adopts them and grants them souls, grants them immortal souls and free will in a sort of interesting, in a story that's much discussed among Tolkien scholars. So this article just discusses Tolkien's version of the Sigurd and of the story of Sigurd. So it's called The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun. And this article, what it does is it looks at Tolkien's retelling of the story, and then it looks at the influence of that retelling in Tolkien's own work. So it's a fascinating article. It shows just how deeply Tolkien was really channeling this like story. So yeah, it just pretty much lists the various chapters. I don't think I have time to actually quote Tolkien's some of the lines from Tolkien's version of the story, but suffice it to say that this is an alliterative poem. So Morris's poem Sigurd the Volsung is a rhyming poem, but Tolkien chose to use a meter more reminiscent of like Beowulf, an alliterative type of poetry that he thought was more representative of the Germanic culture from the Middle Ages. Now, the final thing that I want to point out is Tolkien's creative retelling of the story of Sigurd. So Tolkien does have his own direct retelling, but he's also got this creative retelling where he takes many elements of the story of the Volsungs, complete with the dragon and the smith and the hero and the gods and all this. He takes all these elements and then puts them into his own mythology. And this is a chapter of the Silmarillion called Of Turin Turambar, but the same story also occurs throughout many other versions of Tolkien's mythology, which is very extensive. The History of Middle-earth series is actually 12 books that chronicles the entire development of Tolkien's mythology, and this is one of the major stories that recurs in multiple versions in both poetry and prose. It's also been separately published as The Children of Húrin. And so basically you get a lot of the same elements and a lot of the same story aspects occur in this story. But one of them that's pretty central is the creation aspect and the shape-shifting aspect. So in particular, Tolkien's equivalent of Fafnir, this dragon Glaurung, is actually kind of like a machine. He doesn't actually have his own spirit. So this just seems like there's some influence of maybe the Helm of Terror here, and also Tolkien's theory of sub-creation. So yeah, I guess I should wrap up quickly, but I'll just say that part of the interesting aspect of the Children of Húrin is that the conflict between the quote-unquote good guys and the bad guys it's a conflict of craftsmanship versus chaotic nature, but it's also a metaphysical conflict. Like in Morris, like we saw with Morris's version of the story, it's a conflict over whether you can trust the gods, basically. And the villains, quite convincingly have the answer to that question is no. Now they are defeated, to some extent, but of course this is a story with a tragic end. So I mean, in a way, everyone's defeated. So the story kind of leaves the question open to readers as to whose worldview is actually correct. Okay, so yeah, that went a little bit longer than I was hoping. So hopefully that makes some sense at least. So yeah, I'll just throw it open for questions now, and yeah, please just put questions in the chat.
Thanks so much, Dustin. And yes, if you can go along the bottom there and add a question to the chat. So you came, I just to start off maybe a bit. You obviously came. You talked about getting interested in the Lord of the Rings first, and then you got into Morris. I'm just curious of your own kind of what your path was in terms of reading, being interested in all this.
I actually got into so my great aunt and great uncle gave me a copy of The Hobbit when I was a kid, and I read that, and I loved it, but I didn't realize at that time how important of a writer Tolkien is, or how the depth of Tolkien's engagement with Indo-European traditions of many types, not just the Germanic ones, but Celtic, Finnish, and just, yeah. So there's a vast amount of Tolkien's work that a kid who can read The Hobbit is not going to necessarily appreciate. And so I didn't really know much more about Tolkien. And I actually I got into Morris first because I was interested in the translation of Icelandic literature, specifically Icelandic sagas and Norse mythology into English. And so when I went to graduate school, one of my mentors suggested looking at William Morris. So then I got really into William Morris. I started reading his Icelandic journals and Sigurd the Volsung and his prose romances and stuff, and realized he's a really, really important cultural figure of the 19th century in so many different ways. And then after that, only after that did I realize, hey, Morris was also a really big influence on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and there's this whole kind of continuous tradition here. That if you're interested in what Morris was doing, you can kind of find a lot of influence and equivalence in later writers.
Thank you.
So yeah, that's when I got into more. That's what I actually only read the Lord of the Rings after that. And then I read the Silmarillion and all these other Tolkien works. I'll just be 2 seconds.
Sure.
There we go.
Technology rears its head, eh?
Yeah, exactly.
I'll read you. Thank you. That was a very, very interesting answer, and they're interesting stories, right? You can read them at different levels. You can as a kid, you can appreciate them, and then you see all the depth with them. So Florence Booz, hi Florence, has the question of the relationships between the plots and versions are very interesting, but also complicated. Have you published? Could you distribute some version of the charts and summaries in your talk? Now, I think you were talking about. I don't know if we were going to have your slides that we could put on our website. So I don't know if that covers off what Florence was thinking about, but.
Yeah, it's a great question, and yes, the relationship between the various versions of the story is definitely complicated for sure. And there was actually one point when I wanted to make one simple chart that would represent the entire progression from the translation to Morris's retelling to Tolkien's retelling to Tolkien's creative retelling, and I kind of ended up giving up on that because it just, I mean, if I was going to do that, I would have to focus on, I think, just one character maybe, or one element or one event. But that said, simpler charts, let me go back to the, yeah, okay, so simpler ones like this one. So I've added the actual lines from the poem on the right-hand side, but Berub's article, the entire thing is in this format. Basically, his entire article is one giant chart. And I found it very, very helpful because he goes through all the different parts of the poem and talks about what happens here versus what happens in the source versus how Tolkien may have also used this inspiration somewhere else. And then likewise with Morris, Zeroni's article, I added some things, but yeah, it gives a really good overview, these two charts. So yeah, I will make these slides available for sure, and I hope that these charts are helpful. But there's much more there's each one of these comes from a full article. Zeroni's article has 2 charts, and then Berub's article is one large chart. But yeah, I just tried to take the most relevant parts and kind of fit them together. But yeah, there's a lot going on for sure.
You could paper a room with this, I think, right? And cover the whole complicated web. One question, quite good, we have one here from Christopher Crocker. Is there any evidence that Morris's translation was influenced by translations of the saga into other languages?
That's a good question. So Morris did also translate from, I believe, Greek, Latin, Anglo-Saxon, and French. So certainly that's possible. I don't know that that is the case, although I do know that when composing Sigurd the Volsung, Morris consulted the German Nibelungenlied, which tells some of the same stories. And he probably was also familiar with Anglo-Saxon or early English, versions of the same story, or I guess fragments or traces of the story, because there isn't a full version, in medieval English. So I basically, I would say it's very likely that Morris took into account and was able to read um, relevant historical sources in other languages, but I'm not sure how closely the style of the sagas would have been influenced by a different language other than English or Icelandic. As mentioned, I think he's basically trying to create an archaic style of English that almost like sounds Icelandic. It's like the translation style itself is an argument that English and Icelandic are closely related. Now, like lots of like this is another thing Tolkien thought too. Like there's an article by Tom Shippey called "Tolkien and Iceland: The Philology of Envy," and basically like Tolkien and Morris had this in common. They were two English writers who vastly admired the Icelandic literature and the Icelandic literary traditions, and they wanted their literature and their traditions to be as closely related to it as possible. Yeah.
Interesting. Yep. Christine says thanks. Christopher, excuse me, says thanks. When I remember when we went on our trip to Iceland, one of the things that we learned was that people still tell or still read a lot of the sagas that from 1,000 or more years ago. Is the Volsung one of them that they would still be familiar with and retell, as far as you know?
Yeah, this is a great question. So like this story has been like, partly through Morris and Tolkien, but also in other ways as well. This saga has been very influential on literature, specifically on like heroic fantasy literature. But I wouldn't expect this to be the type of saga that like kids would be reading in school, because it's just some of the stuff that happens in the saga is so brutal, like cannibalism, for example, or like the murder of children. Like there's one case where a woman murders her children and then serves them to her husband as food without him knowing it. And then she tells him about it after the fact, and that's her way of getting revenge on him. So it seems like, I mean, there are some pretty brutal stuff. There's some pretty brutal stuff in Shakespeare, but like, in the same way that like you might read Shakespeare in school, but you're not reading Titus Andronicus, I would imagine that like Icelanders are probably reading sagas, but they're probably not reading this particular saga, at least not until until you reach an age where you can read horrific and shocking things without being too like terrified and revolted. And the other thing too is that this is a legendary saga, so it's set during the Dark Ages, or the fall of Rome era, however we want to term that. And obviously, the term Dark Ages is very controversial, but the sagas of Icelanders, which are about the early settlers of Iceland, and there's a more direct connection, to Icelandic history, and those are also more historical. So I would think that those are probably more relevant to be read for people to be familiar with. But yeah, I would also think that there is certainly a presence. There's a presence in Icelandic consciousness of the story of Sigurd the Volsung, even if it's not as direct of a one as there is for the sagas of Icelanders.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we don't seem to have any more questions. That was such a very informative talk, and just a lot of information. Thank you for your talk, and also thank you for sharing the slides with us. I think some people will be looking at it and maybe going back and looking at cracking open Morris again, or looking at their Tolkien. It's quite a complicated story that you're telling, and that they were both telling. So thank you so much for all your John W. So sorry, John W. had a question. Okay, I didn't see that. So sorry. I will just get to John Wichela's question. Yes, it's funny. This is what I was thinking of too. Even now, the centerpiece of Hollywood blockbusters is built around the character of Loki. So have you seen any of these? Did you enjoy them?
Yeah, so I've seen the first Thor movie. I think it is quite a while ago now, but it's an interesting take. But it is based on a comic book retelling of Norse mythology that changes a lot of things. So like they certainly are drawing inspiration, but I would consider it to be more like a creative retelling than like a direct retelling. So yeah, like they're kind of riffing on Norse mythology, and I do find it interesting. And yes, Loki is an endlessly entertaining character. Obviously, there's a lot of potential there, and I'm hoping to do more publish more things about Loki in the future, because yeah, a very fascinating character, lots and lots of entertainment potential for sure. And yeah, I think they captured at least some of that in the Thor movies, or at least in the one that I saw. There was there was amusement to be had, that's for sure.
Well, thank you very much. We have some comments, people saying great lecture. I know we very much appreciate all the work you've put into this. So thank you so much. It seems like an appropriate thing to be doing in the darker days of winter, to be thinking about these these stories from the north. So thank you so much, Dustin, and all the best to everybody.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated.
Certainly.
Thanks for coming, everyone.